As you get towards finishing up your work, I want you thinking about how you are going to travel with it if you're bringing it into Bisque, and how you're going to identify it as your own. So I have some pieces here that have been identified. I don't have a price tag on it. So here is my maker's mark. That's this. It's this little wooden stamp. And if I've got wet clay, I can press, oops, that's upside down. I can press that stamp into the clay and it'll leave that mark. You probably don't have a stamp. Now you can make one, and in the other set of videos, I do show you, I had one here, where'd it go? I do show you how to make a stamp out of Sculpey, and so I'm gonna pull one out here. I have a little cat stamp that I made. Oops, there we go. If you can get in the light there. I have this little cat stamp, and I can use that. I made it out of Sculpey clay, just oven baked clay, and then I can press that into my pot. And when it comes out, you can see that little cat. And so you can make something like that, your stamp. In fact, if you have children, you might find little toys and things like that. So you can press a little, Barbie shoe into the clay, or a little toy, gizmo or something like that. You can also make a stamp that is your letters, your initials, your name, or something like that. You can also simply sign your name. So I've got like a wooden stick here, and I'm just gonna, usually stamps go on the bottom or the bottom around the edge, or the bottom itself. So I'm gonna sign this, there we go. I'm gonna sign this, Rachel Dorn. And you can see I've got a signature there. Now I've got these little scridgies, these little bits that are sticking up. You can see they're kind of crumbling away. What I usually do is I actually wait until the work is leather hard or bone dry, and then I'll just brush them over the top. You can even use a little bit of a little sanding grit. I have a little sanding pad here, but I actually have just a bit of screen that I usually use to wipe the surface away. Another really useful tool, I like this tool. See this tool? Have you ever seen one of these? Really specific clay tool. But this leaves a nice line, a nice mark. It's nice and thick, and leaves a good clean edge once you get rid of those scridgies. This one's all right as well. And of course, pens and things like that can also be used. If I just popped the tip back in, and now I've got something where I could make those 4 little circles, right? I could make a signature that's made out of other stuff. So my signature could be, a little flower, little design of a flower. So you can choose what your mark is. Usually I have people make sure that they don't have doubled up marks, right? So 2 people in the class don't have the same mark. I'm gonna recommend against using a mark like a heart, or a circle or something like that, just because those tend to get used, and so I don't want doubles. The issue for me is when you bring your stuff in, you're gonna have it in a box, it's gonna be marked, and then when I put it in the kiln, I have to take it out of the box. And so any marking like paper and things like that is not gonna be able to get through the firing, and it's gonna be a couple days because I'm gonna have to turn up the kiln, fire it, let it cool, and then come back to it. And so if you have not marked your work, it's gonna be harder for me to go back and figure out whose it is, how to get it back to you. Other things I want you to think about is weak spots on your clay. So I have some unfired clay here, right? This is wet clay still. You can tell it's wet still or leather hard because I was easily able to press a stamp into it. I also have work here that is bone dry. It's pretty hard to tell the difference between the bone dry and the bisque fired. This one's been in a firing, it's bisque fired, and this one hasn't. One of the best ways to tell is, if you can hear this, works better on a cup. Let me try it on a cup. There we go, we get kind of an echo. And then I'm gonna do the same thing on this unfired one. And this one, I know it hasn't been fired because I didn't fire it, it's got a crack in the bottom, so it never got fired. But I want to show you one of the reasons it's important for us to be holding it like this. You may not break your handle off right away. If you've got a weak spot, you will, but this handle's on here pretty strong. But me handling it like this, is stressing this seam a little bit. So it's a good idea to not, to give your clay as little stress as possible. Handles, stuff like this that is attached can be a weak point, but it's kind of, we have to do this, right? You have to have handles on a mug. But this double attachment makes it stronger. Something like this where it's an attachment on the top, right? It's well attached, scored and slipped. It's strong enough it's gonna survive things. But if I had something like this, now you all know the secret already. This is two pieces that have been attached together. But if I had built this all as one, this would be a particularly weak spot, and this would be a hard one to pack and travel with. It would be hard to bring it to school, which is why I made it in these two separate parts. So you're going to bring in, if you're going to fire anything, you will be bringing in greenware, which is what we call unfired work. And you will be bringing home either bisqueware or glazeware. Now, glazeware is once we put the glaze on it, right? And you have some glazes that came in your kit, and we'll talk about how to use them later. We're not ready for them, just set them aside for a while. But you'll be able to get your work glazed if you'd like it to. I also want to just remind you, any kinds of decorations, right? Even something like this, see how it sticks out quite a ways? Scoring and slipping and make sure that's really strong is important. It's also, though, important, and this is something we hadn't talked about before, it's important that it not be too thick. So if this were a solid piece of clay, now it's not, there's a hole in it, it's a hollow piece, but if this were a solid piece of clay, this would blow up in the kiln. All right, or we would have to let it dry for maybe a month or two. We don't have a month or two to let things dry in this class. So it's important that your work be totally dry when we fire it, but also that it not be super thick, because if it is super thick, we can't get it totally dry. That's the issue. So my rule is about no thicker than your thumb. So this nose might get thicker than my thumb in a couple of spots, but it's not overall thicker than my thumb, right? Your walls of your pieces that you've been pinching, you've been aiming for something close to this. You can see where the mouth is, it gets a little thicker, and that's fine, but it's not thick. It's not thicker than my thumb for a whole large section of the piece. How will I know if you made your stuff too thick? It's going to be hard for me to tell during when we're looking at just pictures, but when it comes into the studio, I'll be able to tell because I'll be able to lift it or pinch my hand around it. So think of keeping things thinner than your thumb. If your thumb is bigger than mine, that's fine. This is a rough estimate. Maybe thinner than an inch if you want to get very, very technical. Make sure those attachments are really strong. So not too thick, not too thin either, so it doesn't get weak. Strong attachments, and then think about how are you going to be able to wrap this up so it can come into the studio to get fired. And then that last reminder, make sure that there's a maker's mark on it so I can figure out whose it is. It needs to be a legible maker's mark, and that should be down here or around here. Put your maker's mark on the very inside and we've got problems, because after we put the glaze on, I'm still gonna have to figure out whose it is. And if you put your maker's mark inside or up here, I'm gonna have a hard time reading it once it's covered in glaze. Because glaze, depending how thick it is, I'm gonna pick up this really awful one. Depending how thick this glaze is, it can cover up and obscure some of the textures that you have. All right, so we're not ready to glaze and fire quite yet, but I did want you to be thinking of that as you go to finish these pieces up. You're also going to want to dry these pieces. Make sure you dry them nice and slow. If you've been building on them for at least 2 days, you want them to dry for at least 2 days. If you've attached stuff to leather hard, give it another day or two to dry. There's no need for us to rush the drying. So keep them lightly covered in plastic once you're done with them. Tightly covered in plastic while you're working on them, but lightly covered once you're done with them, and let them dry slowly. When they are at this stage, they're also pretty fragile, so make sure if you have other people in your home, make sure that you're keeping things away and out of reach of little hands or little paws, or big hands and big paws that might cause you some trouble. Thanks.